Well, thank you. My batteries are gone. I would normally wear my hat, so I'm going to do that. Normally I'm under arms, so I actually wear a sword and so on. But tonight, being I was going to walk past the police department, I decided discretion was the better part of valor. And anyhow, I introduced myself a little bit earlier. I'm Benjamin Scheier of Company B, 1st New Jersey Light Artillery, and Sergeant Major of the Artillery Reserve of the 2nd Corps. I'm actually a Jersey boy from Newark, although we did settle down into Long Branch after the war. So we're local as well. In any case, what I'd like to talk about is New Jersey during the Civil War and some of the stories that people tell about the state, and I call them myths. Now, New Jersey was a really complicated place during the war, and it was a contradictory kind of a place. The governor, Charles Smith Olden, had been a member of the group of people who wanted to avoid war at any cost. And he was, in fact, he was a Republican, and he was the only governor to attend the peace conference in Washington in 1861, in February. But once the attack occurred at Fort Sumter, he immediately changed tacks and actually pursued the war very aggressively to make sure that New Jersey's troops were provided and that they were provided for. In fact, the uniforms and equipment were provided under Olden were superior to what soldiers would receive later from the federal government. So Olden really did very well by the state. But also the state was a little bit peculiar in that it had tremendous ties to the South. And so people doubted the loyalty of the state because it bordered on Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, all of which are slave states. And Maryland and Virginia certainly had very, very active secessionist movements. Delaware, not so much. But so people wondered whether New Jersey would secede from the Union to stay with the South. Obviously not thinking that New Jersey's bordered by Pennsylvania and New York, about which there were no doubts. And finally, the New Jersey would not free its last slaves until after the Civil War. Okay? However, New Jersey was a free state by law, and it had gradually emancipated almost all the slaves and former slaves, now known as apprentices, by 1860. So people found New Jersey really confusing, and to this day, people find it confusing. So I want to take on 3 myths, that's probably about all I'll have time for in 45 minutes, and try to explain what really happened. And in my explanation, I'm going to try to give you enough background that you can see where the myth came from, as well as see why the myth was not true. We'll start with the first myth, that South New Jersey, being close to slave states, preferred slavery, and North Jersey, bordering Pennsylvania and New York, actually preferred abolition. First of all, we should understand that opposition to slavery in the New Jersey mind did not mean supporting abolition. So if you were to do a survey back in 1860 and ask, are you an abolitionist? Odds are the person will say, no way. Or its 18th century equivalent, no way. But if you were to ask them, do you find slavery an obnoxious practice? Almost all New Jerseyans will say yes, it's an evil and should be done away with. Now, try to reconcile that contradiction. But anyhow, this goes back to the good old days of the 17th century. In 1678, New Jersey was divided up between 2 of the king's friends. The fellow on the top, on the left, is Lord Berkeley of Stratton, and the fellow on the bottom is Sir George Carteret. And of course, to this day, in what will become West Jersey, you see that blue line? That divides West Jersey from East Jersey. And in fact, in what was West Jersey, but is now South Jersey, and I'll get to that, there is a town of Berkeley. And of course, up near Rahway, in East Jersey, there's a town called Carteret. Okay? Now that's kind of an odd map. You'll notice north points to the right. So I'm going to turn this right side up, and I'm going to put a modern silhouette of the state in place. Okay? So I've just rotated the map so we can see it kind of the way we see it today. And East Jersey, okay, belonging to Carteret. And these were what were called proprietary colonies. It meant it belonged to these men and their descendants. But anyhow, there it is, 1674. Should have spoken that properly. East Jersey, under Carteret, is primarily settled by the English and Dutch. And if there's one institution that the English and Dutch truly loved and truly agreed upon, was slavery. Whether it was indentured servitude or whether it was permanent African slavery. Either way, they just loved it. West Jersey, on the other hand, belonging to Lord Berkeley, it basically is settled originally by Swedes and Quakers and some Finns. It was originally the area around Gloucester County, basically, is New Sweden. And then there was an attempt at Newfoundland. And then the Swedes were conquered by the Dutch, so it became part of New Netherlands. And of course, the Dutch were conquered by the English, and so it became part of East Jersey, or I'm sorry, West Jersey. So in any case, of these groups of people, the Quakers, the Swedes, and the Finns have no tradition of slavery. Okay? The Quakers, it's a religious thing. For the Finns and Swedes, it's just the Scandinavians never went into it. Okay? So the only people who brought slaves with them were the English and the Dutch. And we'll see the effects of that in like 1800 in the U.S. Census. Now, the problem here is going to be, you're going to have to kind of imagine this, because the records for, I wrote 7, but 8 counties are missing. They got lost in a flood or a fire or something. But what we do have is the overall tallies, and there are about 12,000 slaves in 1800 in New Jersey. This is about the peak of New Jersey's slavery experience. And you see that up in East Jersey, there are about 10 to 11 times as many slaves as down in West Jersey. So you can really see the effect of having the English and Dutch settle East Jersey, and the Quakers, the Swedes, and the Finns diluting the Dutch and the English in West Jersey. Now, over the years, New Jerseyans begin to think of the state as divided as north and south instead of east and west. And this starts to occur, the first references are right around the Civil War or a little bit after. Okay, so we're talking the late 19th century. So people think of North Jersey above that red line, and those are 13 counties that have been basically East Jersey. South Jersey, on the other hand, is essentially 8 counties that were essentially West Jersey, except for the county of Ocean. Ocean County actually gets flipped out of where it was, okay, and gets counted as South Jersey. So that's a little strange state there. The interesting point that's here, and I'm going to bring this up even though we're all Monmouth County people, is you see how Ocean County has this like little hook under Burlington County? That wasn't there for a very long time. And the reason that hook is there is the beginning of the blue dashed line that divided East Jersey from West Jersey, started in Little Egg Harbor. And in 1890, Little Egg Harbor is ceded from Burlington and annexed by Ocean. Okay? Just a little irony of this. Okay, moving on though. And I'm sorry that you're watching so many maps, but what's going to happen is, as a result of this first myth, the other two will go very quickly. So bear with all the maps. So when we look at it in terms of north and south, looking at 1800 census, you see very clearly, again, North Jersey, like East Jersey, has just about 90% of New Jersey's slaves, and the rest are in South Jersey. Now what happens is, some Quakers from South Jersey begin to agitate, okay, shortly after the Revolutionary War, that if all men are created equal, then that means you can't have slaves. And this view actually was echoing the British, who taunted the New Englanders of, you say you're fighting for freedom, well, how can you have freedom and still have slaves? So in the revolutionary spirit of the time, okay, these liberals, if you will, because they were the liberals of their age, decided that it was right. You had to be consistent. We had to get rid of slaves. And that's why it begins up in New England. New Jersey is the very last state to start emancipating slaves. Okay? We're just in. And it starts in 1804, and as I said, it starts with agitation by prominent Quakers from South Jersey. Gradual emancipation is put in for all slaves born after July 4th, 1804. So their children will be free. Okay? But they themselves will remain slaves. Now this gradual emancipation is taking place, and in 1846, New Jersey comes up with the last of several laws regarding slaves that actually abolishes the institution of slavery. It does away with it. All slaves are now free. The problem with that is everyone's scared. At this time, there were about 500 slaves. What's going to happen if you let 500 people suddenly into the workforce? Now, to the rich man, that's not a big deal. He doesn't care. That's more people to work for him, and he can push down wages. For the working guy, okay, this is a major threat because there are more workers available. They can push down the wages. Okay, there wasn't a minimum wage yet. All right, so the solution to it was to emancipate these slaves gradually. And the way that New Jersey is going to do it, see, since they can't call them slaves anymore, because slavery is now illegal, is they call them apprentices. Now, apprenticeship was still in place, okay? So, for example, if Mary Jane has a son that she has to do something with, she goes and she apprentices him to a blacksmith. And he's bound to apprenticeship for some number of years, okay? So this is what, I'm sorry to pick on you, but anyhow, so now you have these apprentices, and they're going to be released from their servitude, or the periods of service as they were known, according to their birth dates. Okay? So you're going to get a few each year being released. Now you ask the question, what happens to the slave owner? Okay? He's just lost property. But you see, and he's picked up the responsibility of his apprentice's children, because those children are free, right? There's no more slavery for that generation. So he's stuck paying for these people. So the New Jersey law actually allowed slave owners to put out their children to orphanages for the poor, and the state paid them $3 a month for their upkeep. not a bad deal. I mean, the slave owner makes money, and he gets rid of the child, so he gets rid of that expense. Okay, and of course the parents will retrieve the child when they are eventually emancipated. Okay, so we got that one. So now, you see, New Jersey is in this funny situation by 1860 where it's a free state, right? Slavery has been abolished by law. There are no more slaves. However, the 1860 census has no way to account for apprentices, and especially for the few apprentices who are apprentices for life because they were born before 1804, before emancipation begins. Okay, so they're this forgotten group, and it's going to be about a dozen of them by the end of the war. In any case, you have these 19 slaves, but New Jersey is a free state, which is kind of confusing, right? And so there is a myth that New Jersey was a slave state. And the Census Bureau, even though they enumerated 19 slaves, makes it very clear in the introduction of its report of the 1860 census that there are 15 slave states. Those 15, by the way, are the 11 that seceded from the Union, along with Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Okay, border states. Delaware, of course, will side with the Union. Maryland, under the threat of force, will side with the Union. And Kentucky and Missouri will officially stay with the Union, but it's going to be a god-awful mess out there. Okay? They have their own civil wars going on within the state. So, back to New Jersey. We have these 19 slaves, and you can see the effect now of the cultures. Okay, let me go back and just point out one thing on the slide. Hey, what are you doing? It does not want to cooperate with me. There we go. Anyhow, in the previous slide, you saw all the slaves, all 19 are in North Jersey. All 19 of them. Okay? So, now come the 1860 election. Okay? What are the New Jersey sentiments? I'm sorry, am I standing in your way?
No.
Okay. What are the New Jersey sentiments? Well, the northern part of the state has long experience with slavery. It's been part of their culture. Downstate, in South Jersey, it hasn't been so much. So come the election, Douglas, okay, Stephen Douglas, Northern Democrat, and he is a proponent of allowing slavery wherever it's legal. Okay? And not only that, but allowing it to extend into the territories. So he's pro-slavery. So he carries 55% of North Jersey in the popular vote. Abraham Lincoln belongs to this radical Republican Party, which at that time was a very liberal party. And he proposes to leave slavery where it is, but to forbid it from the territories. That's the official Republican platform. However, Southerners, who will eventually secede, and other people don't believe Lincoln. The Republican Party is new. It's only been around a few years. And they believe that he's going to try to abolish slavery even in the states where it is. Okay? So, with all of that, South Jersey goes for Lincoln 56% of the popular vote. Now, what's really kind of neat here is North Jersey and South Jersey are like mirror images. Really kind of neat. They're totally opposite. But anyhow, to get to the end of this myth, okay, the South Jersey did not prefer slavery, and North Jersey certainly did not prefer abolition. It was exactly the opposite way around. So you can think about it. New Jersey was upside down, right? Because the North was free and the South was slave. And here we have the North goes for slave, and the South goes for free. Okay? New Jersey didn't even make sense 100 years ago. Okay?
Wait, Bob.
Yes.
Lincoln got 7 electoral votes.
Yes.
Douglas got 4.
Right.
So there were more electoral votes in South Jersey than there were in North Jersey?
Well, there was a formula that was worked out. I'm kind of simplifying the election. There were actually 3 Democrats that ran. Okay? They were Stephen Douglas from Illinois. There were Breckinridge and Bell, who were both Southerners. Okay? They were Southern Democrats. And they differed on the issue of slavery in the territories. Okay? So when it comes to New Jersey, there's actually a Republican on the ticket and what's called a Democrat fusion candidate on the ticket. All right? So you start with that complication. The other is that New Jersey had a formula by which to calculate how many electors. And electors in those days could change their minds and vote for whomever they wanted. Okay? So, these electors get together, and as it works out from the formula, and one guy who is accused of casting his vote the wrong way, okay? But I think really the guy just changed his mind and decided to put his vote for Lincoln. Lincoln winds up with 7 electoral votes, okay, and Douglas with 4. It's a real complicated political thing. It's guys with cigars in a back room, is really what it is, okay? So, now this is a long answer to the first myth, but it now lays the base for everything else. So if there are any questions about this myth, let's do that now, and I'm going to start into the next ones. Okay, I've either put everybody to sleep or I'm clear. Going on here, now we get away from the maps, at least that map. You don't have to watch it anymore. Okay, the second myth is that the loyalties of New Jerseyans were divided by the Mason-Dixon line. Okay? And that because of that division of loyalties, secession in New Jersey failed by 1 vote. Okay? Anybody know just how wrong that myth is? Well, you're about to see. Well, let's start with the geographical part of it. Sorry, another map. Okay, the Mason-Dixon line is part of a very complex situation between Maryland and Pennsylvania. The Penn family that owned Pennsylvania claimed property far into Maryland. On the other hand, the Calvert family that owned Maryland claimed property about 30 miles into Pennsylvania. And in fact, there were Marylanders and Pennsylvanians who actually spilled blood over this issue of who do they belong to. So, in 1763, 2 guys, Mason and Dixon, set out to do the survey along the southern, to fix the border of southern Pennsylvania and to fix the eastern border of Maryland. Okay? Now, the thing to remember is Delaware at this time is part of Pennsylvania. Ah, I see eyes suddenly light up. Yes, it was part of Pennsylvania, but it was kind of flaky because the 3 counties of Delaware were basically granted semi-autonomy. So Harrisburg didn't play games too much with Delaware. Okay, whose capital at that time was Newcastle, I believe, and Delaware made no move to get away from Pennsylvania until 1776. Okay, independence has struck. Okay, and the colonies are leaving the crown. So Delaware decides, hey, it's about time for us to leave Pennsylvania, and they became a state. But anyhow, the whole thing is that the line itself had no name. Okay? It was merely the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland, and that's all. So, comes 1820. Okay? Anybody remember what the big national issue was of 1820? Go ahead. No? 1820, the Missouri Compromise. Okay? Are we going to have are we going to continue free territories, or are some of these territories going to be slave? And in 1820, a line is drawn at 30 degrees 30 minutes. Well, it's very close to the Pennsylvania border, which is roughly 30 degrees 49 minutes. So, along the way to coming up with this Missouri Compromise line in 1820, somebody actually says, let's do it according to the southern boundary of Pennsylvania, okay, Mason's and Dixon's line. And that's how it got its name. Okay? So, it becomes this Civil War metaphor because of the 1820 line, okay, for the Civil War. Free states to the north of the Mason-Dixon line, slave states to the south. Well, it doesn't have anything to do with New Jersey. It had to do with Pennsylvania and Maryland and Delaware. Nothing to do with New Jersey. So some people like to continue the line on across into Jersey and say, aha, you see, New Jersey was divided by the Mason-Dixon line, and the slaves were in the north and the south was free. Well, you've already seen the data. Do you think that's right? Not a chance. Okay? So, but just to make the point further, here are our historical lines. The blue line dating from the provinces, or from the colonies, the two colonies. We have the red line from how New Jerseyans started to think north and south, and there's that green dashed line, that's the Mason-Dixon line. And it illustrates, doesn't have a doggone thing to do with the politics or the history that we've seen so far. Totally meaningless. But the question still remains, was there a secession movement? Okay, and was that secession movement to the south of the Mason-Dixon line or to the north of the Mason-Dixon line? Okay, that's still an open question. Well, it turns out that there was never a question of secession. There was never a secession convention. The legislature never considered calling a convention. And in fact, New Jerseyans didn't want a convention. And here are two leading politicians, the first being Governor Olden, who basically said that New Jersey is going to stand up to this crisis and is going to stay loyal to the Union. On the bottom is a guy named Frederick Tease. Anybody ever hear of him? No. Frederick Tease is one of these guys who was powerful at the time. He was the Speaker of the Assembly. Okay? So it's essentially the state equivalent of the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And he had heard rumors that New Jersey would side with the South. Remember I mentioned that because the border is the South? All right? And Tease comes back and says, how mistaken was that opinion? There's nobody here who wants to secede. There's no pro-Southern sentiment. Okay? Now, with these two political leaders, do you think they would even allow a secession convention? Nope. Not even a consideration. So, New Jersey is a free state with 18 slaves. It's loyal to the Union, and not even a question about it. Moving on to the next, we talk about Copperheads. Anybody ever hear of the Copperheads? Okay, go on.
They were anti-fighting the South. They were pro-us they were more pro-South than pro-North, I guess.
Very good way to put it. It's a good way to put it. They are Democrats. They're formally called Peace Democrats, by the way, who believe that avoiding war with the South at any cost, even at the cost of cleaving the Union, is worthwhile. Okay? They are totally anti-war. Okay? But they're Democrats, and that's important to remember. New Jersey, back 150 years ago, was still a Democratic state. Okay? Even though the Democratic Party at that time was the Conservative Party, and the newly formed Republicans were the Liberals. Yeah, it's kind of confusing, isn't it? We're used to thinking it the other way around in modern politics. But the parties will change in the early 20th century, but we're not there yet. So, here is the last slide you're going to have to look at. This looks at how many copperheads made it into the U.S., were sent from the New Jersey to the U.S. Senate and sent by New Jersey to the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, what's neat about this slide, okay, now we got to think back. This is before the 17th Amendment. So senators are selected by the state legislature. The U.S. representatives are elected by the will of the people directly. Okay? So, in the U.S. Senate, what I did is each copperhead, I marked his name with a black mark. Okay, so I'm kind of blackballing him, seeing that I'm wearing the blue suit. In any case, James Wall is sent to the Senate. Okay? Now, here's a neat little story. Anybody here of Wall Township? Well, Wall Township is named for his father. Okay? Anyhow, we have a fellow, John Thompson, who's a Democrat, and he's serving his term in the Senate, and he dies in September 1862, which leaves over the rest of his term until March 4th of 1863. Well, it turns out that the New Jersey legislature has already adjourned for the winter. So Olden takes the opportunity to make a recess appointment, and he appoints a fellow, Richard Field. Now, Richard is a dyed-in-the-wool Lincolnite, and he makes impassioned speeches on the floor of the Senate, okay? And he denigrates Democrats at every opportunity he gets. Well, the legislature reconvenes in January. And since it's controlled by the Democrats, okay, the Democrats are insulted by all the things that Field had said about them in the Senate. So they went ahead and found themselves the most radical Democrat they could get their hands on, and that happened to be James Wall. So from January through March, or up to March, Wall is in the U.S. Senate, and he's making a big name for himself by opposing Lincoln at every turn and the war at every turn he gets. Well, as it turns out, Wall was not particularly popular in New Jersey. Okay? Because New Jerseyans were not particularly anti-war. Okay? In fact, they were pro-war. They, in fact, held the opinion that the war was about majority rule versus states' rights. And a number of New Jersey newspapers and so on have editorials and quotes from local citizens who are basically saying that majority rule is the basis of our nation. And they oppose states' rights and therefore oppose the South. Okay? Now, that also says that unlike the southern states, I'm getting a little far afield here, New Jerseyans saw themselves as Americans as well as New Jerseyans. They saw a nation, and they were fighting to defend that nation and keep that nation whole. Whereas much of the, through the South, much of the appeal, for example, Robert E. Lee, okay, resigned from the U.S. Army. Why? Because he would have to make war against his family in Virginia. And he was a Virginian. Okay? So, they driven that point into the ground. Anyhow, in November 1862, Wall loses the election because New Jerseyans don't sympathize with him. And they elect William Wright, who goes to the Senate on March 4th of 63. Wright, as it turns out, is an obnoxious guy. Okay? The Democrats in the State House don't like him. Okay? But he's got money. Does that sound familiar? Okay? He's got oodles of money. And so he basically buys the legislature to make him a senator. And it turns out out that he has no conviction of anything other than his own self-importance. And it turns out he's in ill health, and he sets a record. He missed 3/4 of all the votes in the Senate during his term. Okay? So basically, he was a do-nothing. Now, we'll get to the House of Representatives. There are 2 copperheads there that I've blackballed. And they have opposed the idea of war ever since it first came up. Okay? So, they're just marked there. They're copperheads. They were copperheads start to finish. But they were elected in their districts. So some of the history tends to read that what really got them elected were local issues in their counties, okay, rather than their national stances. And with that, I'll open the floor to questions.
Wait,
Okay?
They had more than 2 senators?
Well,
those days?
no. What we were watching was through time, through the various Congresses. You only have 2 senators at a time. But what happened was Thompson, who's in the first class, as it's called, couldn't serve out his term. So the governor, since the legislature he put in his recess appointment. When the legislature comes back, that term in the Senate still is not over, but they put in their peace Democrat. Okay, because of what the governor's guy. What?
I said a Republican governor is going to appoint a Republican.
Absolutely. And that fellow Richard Field really had no love of Democrats.
Now,
Okay.
can half the states secede and one half cannot?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me get to
So what about this?
I have a great slide for that. Now, this is not the direct answer to the question, but what I've done is I've listed out all 34 states of the Union at the time of the secession. The red line denotes the area south of it was all occupied by slave states, and north of it are all free states. There are 19 free states, and there are 15. Let me get out of your way. Okay. There are 19 free states. There are 15 slave states. Of those 15, 11 will secede. Okay, and they're in gray. Okay, I figured that was the color of the uniform. I'll make it their color. The ones in the green, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, all officially stayed in the Union. Delaware was absolutely loyal. Maryland was kind of iffy. They provided troops to the federal government, and they provided troops to the Confederate government. Now, it's not that the state did it officially, it's just Marylanders formed units, like the 1st Maryland Artillery of the Confederate States of America. Okay, so it was a group of Marylanders who got together and did that. Same thing happened in Kentucky and Missouri. These were states where the state officially stayed in the Union. Kentucky, for about the first year of the war, actually stated that it was neutral. It did not provide troops to the Union, okay, and it did not provide troops to the Confederates. However, Kentuckians chose up their own sides within the states, okay? And so, as Kentucky loses its neutrality, it stays in the Union. It provides about 60,000 troops to the federal government, or to the national government, and about 10,000 Kentuckians form units and fight for the South. In Missouri, Missouri has its own civil war going on, and it's had this civil war going on for a long time. So, Missourians divided themselves up in and of themselves and formed their own units. And this is where you find a lot of guerrilla war going on. Missouri officially stays Union. It answers Lincoln's calls and provides troops. But Missourians who sympathize with slavery and the South issues in general will form their own units under the name Missouri and will fight for the Confederacy. Did that make any sense?
Well, or we say there was some rumor that the legislature is the one that does this, right?
Right.
Who make the decision to secede, is that correct?
Well, the way it worked in every state that seceded was that the legislature decided to hold or to convene a secession convention, at which the delegates elected to that convention would make the decision. New Jersey never got that far, okay? Because the governor would not recommend it, and the Speaker of the Assembly considered it treason, okay? And it turns out that the leader of the Senate also considered it treason. So the three most powerful people who would be involved in calling this convention make sure it never happens.
Now, if we wanted to secede from the United States, it would be the same procedure today?
That's a good question. I don't know.
I mean, Rick Perry's always talking about seceding. Texas is going to secede.
Yeah!
How would we do that?
Yeah. Well, yes. Ostensibly, what would be done, at least in terms of these days, Texas is an interesting story. Let me do it that way. The governor of Texas is a fellow named Sam Houston. Anybody ever hear of him?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Sam Houston is pro-union.
Oh.
Okay? He's pro-union. And he says he will not recommend and put in a bill calling for a secession convention. But the legislature is totally convinced that it wants to join the Confederacy. Now, the Confederacy already exists by the time Texas gets into it. 6 states had already formed it, okay? And those 6 states were South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, okay? Now, Texas wants out. It's got Indian problems on the border, and the only United States Army at that time was about 16,000 men. And they've got to guard the Canadian border, because there's still problems up there, okay, as well as the border with Mexico, and subdue the Indians in the Northern Territories, and subdue the Indians in what will become Oklahoma. Needless to say, 16,000 men is not a whole heck of a lot to be scattered that far. So Texas has this complaint that the federal government isn't helping them defeat the Indians. Okay? They also have the complaint that that the United States government had put the territories certain territories off limits to slaveholders, and Texas is a slave state. In fact, Texas became Texas because it refused abolition when it was part of Mexico. So it had seceded from Mexico over the issue of slavery. And now it's going to secede from the United States over the issue of slavery. So the legislature gets together and over Sam Houston's objections, okay, overwhelmingly pass an ordinance calling for election to a convention. And it was passed by such a wide margin that Houston could not veto it. And that's how Texas wound up there.
So they seceded. And they went to
Oh yeah.
convention.
Oh yeah. Texas was definitely secessionist. Well, the trouble is, most of us are old enough that we studied American history in high school too long ago to remember all this stuff. Okay? But anyhow, that's what it is. And it's really kind of neat because there's this opinion. If you read a lot of things published by Southerners, they'll tell you slavery was never the issue. Okay? And it absolutely was. And this line kind of shows that. The country fractures right along that line. Okay? Beside the fact, states' rights. Okay? Who here likes the idea of states' rights in a modern context? Okay, states should be able to make their own laws, and the government should leave them alone. Okay. Okay, so here's the deal with states' rights in the Civil War. All right, what is it? What is it that the South needs the right to legislate? Slavery. Okay? The government, see, if the government abolishes slavery, all these slaveholders, and that's about 38% of all households in the Deep South, okay, are going to lose prized possessions. Slaves were expensive. It's like buying a Cadillac or a Lexus, okay? And if you're really a big plantation owner, you have 100 Lexuses or BMWs, okay? Nobody wants to lose that, okay? So, well, actually, let me backtrack. I'm going to do this a little bit better. 1828 is an important year. Oh, okay, 1828. In 1828 was passed the highest tariff ever passed in American history. Okay? Who cares? Well, you see what happened is after the War of 1812, it became obvious to the Congress and to the presidents that the United States was woefully unprepared because it didn't have the infrastructure, okay? And it didn't have the money to build that infrastructure. So, since there was no income tax in those days and no sales tax in those days, the way the government raised money was through tariffs. So, this plays into another theme that the North is developing industry in place of agriculture. Okay, this is with the power Slater and the power loom in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. Okay, or in the area of Woonsocket. And the South has responded to that need for textiles, for cotton, by expanding cotton production, and they needed manpower quickly. They weren't getting the immigrants that the North was getting, okay? So they went out and they bought their labor, okay, in the form of Africans. So, cotton production, which had been minimal, okay, there'd been just a little bit on it on some islands off South Carolina, because you couldn't separate the seeds from the cotton. Remember this story, Eli Whitney and the cotton gin? Well, that comes about the same time as the power loom. So now the South can produce cotton. And cotton agriculture starts to take place in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and into Texas. Okay? And they prefer that. Before they were doing tobacco and indigo and rice. Okay? But this is much more profitable. And they have to buy their labor. 1808. Guess what happens? 1808, it becomes illegal to import slaves into the United States. Okay? Now, what happens when you prohibit people from buying what they want to buy?
Oh, they're going to do it anyhow.
Absolutely. And what happens to the price? Absolutely. So now, all of these plantation owners who've been struggling along, all of a sudden see the value of their property suddenly increase. Okay? And now it becomes worthwhile for states like Virginia and Tennessee to actually breed slaves. Now, this has been a habit anyway. If you had too many children, too many slave children, you sold them off to somebody. Okay? But now it was profitable to actually raise slaves the same way one would raise livestock. Okay, and I'm sorry, that's a terrible image, but that's how it was thought. All right? So now, there's pressure to expand your cotton production, because after all, you can buy slaves internally, or you can have them smuggled from Africa, and the U.S. Navy is pretty busy trying to do that. So they want to get into the territories. The Nebraska territory out in the area of Kansas. Okay? They're not particularly interested in the Southwest because that's desert. That's not good for slavery. okay? But a little north of there, into Nevada and Utah, Colorado. These are attractive places to expand. So they put pressure on doing that. 1828, though, back to the tariff, all right? Ever hear of a guy named John C. Calhoun? John C. Calhoun was vice president to Adams and to Jackson, and this is during Jackson's term. He's a South Carolinian, and he's approached to find a way to argue against the tariff of 1828, because it really furnishes money to the North to build the infrastructure that manufacturing needs, but that agriculture doesn't need. Okay, so there's a feeling the South is being disadvantaged, in addition to being limited in its expansion. So, this guy, Calhoun, comes up with the argument called nullification. And the idea is that since the states are equal and sovereign, that they have the right to decide whether a law is constitutional or not, and whether or not they're going to actually abide by the law. Okay? And this is the basis of, and Calhoun, in a letter to a guy named Virgil Maxey in Maryland, actually comes out and says there's no disguising the fact that the issue is slavery. Okay? That because of its climate and background, the South has got this, and that because their system works differently than the North, okay, the North is more populous than this, populated, I'm sorry, let me try speaking English, populated at the time, okay, the South was always at a disadvantage. So the only argument that Calhoun could come up with was states' rights, okay? Now, does anybody know what the problem is with that argument? Kind of neat. Okay. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states were equal and sovereign. The Continental Congress, or Confederation Congress as it will be called, has no power to enforce its laws. Okay? Now, is that the case with the federal government under the Constitution? No. In point of fact, the president is made the commander-in-chief not only of the regular forces, but of all the state's militias. So he has military at his disposal. Also, there's now a system of federal courts. So now you can bring suit and force the states by law. Okay? So the states are no longer sovereign. Okay? They're partially sovereign, but they're not totally sovereign as they were under the Articles of Confederation. Now, let's talk about equal. They're equal in the Senate, right? Everybody gets 2 senators. But how about the House of Representatives?
Population.
Not at all. It's based on population. So now, states are not equal by virtue of representation based on population. So here is Calhoun advocating states' rights. And this will play down into the Civil War, okay, with southern states talking about their states' rights to hold their slaves, okay, and will play even into modern politics, okay, on a number of issues. So there's a real problem. So people will say, I like the idea of states' rights, but in point of fact, states' rights, even by the 10th Amendment, are highly constricted. It's an interesting situation. And I'm sorry, I'm way off the topic, but is anyone still awake? Okay, I haven't put everybody to sleep. Any last questions? Because I'm probably over time. Well, gee, thanks. I always had this opinion. I've always wanted to speak to a society like this of people who are interested in history, figuring I could give a deeper talk like this than the fun things about uniforms and things like that. And with that, if there are no more questions, thank you very much for having me.